So what is the difference between greed and covetousness? They're both their feelings, right? They're both internal thought processes of how you get it. I think that you start with covetousness because usually you covet that which you do not have, that you want but you do not have. Greed says, I'm going to hang on to everything that I do have, but I'm also going to want more and more and more. And so they are very interconnected. So when we talk about this, we often think of this covetousness or greed as a private sin. But though it may begin in the heart, it often finds its way into the hands in the form of greed. Let me illustrate. She owns a string of hotels. She owned a string of hotels. She owned the Empire State Building. She was a billionaire. Yet in September of 1989, Leona Mindy Rosenthal Helmsley was convicted on 33 counts of tax evasion for which she faced the possibility of being sent to prison for 100 years. And she was nearly that old when I remember back in that time. She looked that old. According to Time magazine, she emerged as a penny-pinching tyrant who tried to stiff just about everybody. No amount of money was too small to fight over. After the sudden death of her only son, at age 40 in 1982, she sued and won the lion's share of his estate, $149,000, leaving his 4 children with $432 each and his widow with $2,171. It is. And this is historical fact. How would you like to be raised by such a person? How would you like to be under the thumb or have to work for such a person? Greed, though, is no respecters of person. It does not attack only the billionaires, only the rich. From the billionaire, at which we love to point fingers because they have what we don't, to the pauper in the gutter who steals because he wants what he cannot have. It's not confined to the world either. As pastors covet other churches, specifically their congregations, trying to find ways to win them over. After all, the more you have, the more money you get paid, right? Government leadership covets more power, wanting to be the end all, the one everyone comes to with their vote, and being the head cheese in whatever area of government they serve. Even poor old farmers can be found coveting land, as in a short story written by Tolstoy, which was about a successful peasant farmer who was not satisfied with his lot. He wanted more of everything, and one day he received a novel offer. For 1,000 rubles, he could buy all the land that he could walk around in a day. The only catch in the deal was that he had to be back at his starting point by sundown. Early the next morning, he started out walking at a fast pace. And by midday, he was very tired, but he kept going, covering more and more ground. Well into the afternoon, he realized that his greed had taken him far from the starting point. He quickened his pace, and as the sun began to sink low in the sky, he began to run, knowing that if he did not make it back by sundown, the opportunity to become an even bigger landholder would be lost. As the sun began to sink low on the horizon, he came within sight of his finish line. Gasping for breath, his heart pounding, he called upon every bit of strength left in his body and staggered across the line just before the sun disappeared. He immediately collapsed, blood streaming from his mouth, and in a few minutes, he was dead. Afterwards, his servants dug a grave. It was not much over 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The title of Tolstoy's story was, How Much Land Does a Man Need? That's what these pictures are all about. There's the one picture, there's the other one. Jeremiah recognized this problem a few years later when he said, From the least of them, even to the greatest of them, everyone is greedy for gain. And from the prophet even to the priest, everyone deals falsely. The prophet Micah had these words to say about this type of greed. In chapter 2, verse 1, "Woe to them that devise iniquity and work evil upon their beds. When morning is light, they practice it because it is in the power of their hands. And they covet fields, and they take them by violence, and houses, and take them away. They oppress a man and his house, even a man and his heritage." In this passage, the prophet communicates 4 factors in God's judgment against the covetous leaders, all meant to serve as warnings to us, as a warning to us, the often poor and helpless who are taken advantage of. It's to the ones who were being oppressed that needed to hear this message. It wouldn't do the oppressors any good to hear this message. They couldn't repent by this time. Their judgment was set in stone. Why do we need to hear these warnings? Because first, no one is above sin. Even the poorest can fall into greed, but especially coveting what we do not have. We can fall into a place of greed when we begin coveting that we do not have, because we won't let go of what we do. Second, because we live in a country where at any moment, any person, rich or poor, well-known or nobody, big or small, can achieve greatness and leadership. So what type of leader will you be? We have 2 teenagers in here, or 2 young people in here. And one day, you will find your place in this world. The question is, if you rise to a place of leadership, what type of leader will you be? Will you be one corrupted by greed? Or will you be one who is generous and who would offer your shirt, offer your back for anyone in need? And so we must be ready to hear and heed the cautions of God, even counting the judgments against the wicked as road signs to the righteous. So what are these 4 factors? Well, the first is found in verse 1. The prophet declares the wicked's intent. Notice the word woe. Woe to them that devise evil. There's a passionate cry of grief or despair. That's what woe refers to. It's the same word. You could use the word in the, I guess back in the Middle Ages, alas, as the British used to say, alas. It's a cry of despair or grief. Habakkuk says, woe to him who gets evil gain for his house, to put his nest on high, to be delivered from the hand of calamity. That's just somebody who simply puts themselves in a place where nothing can affect or take away what they have. It's all based upon this idea of greed. The writer, right off the bat, decries the actions of these rich rulers. And I notice how he calls them out. He goes back and says, those who devise iniquity. It's the same, the word devise is the same word we talked about this morning in Sunday school. That's translated impute. It means to regard. Impute means to regard, to consider, or to ponder. But in this particular context, this word is someone who it here means to think about, to imagine, to plan. They were imagining and planning their ways to make their wishes come true. What were those ways? Those were devising schemes that would take from the poor and pad their pockets. Take the very lands that they had, their houses that they had, the properties that they had. Take it away from them. And it's not just a one-time thing, by the way. This is an active participle, implying that there's a continual action. It's a night after night. Ideas is their iniquity is being devised over and over again. Night after night, plotting, scheming, hoping for the day they get their hands on the old man's home. Declaring their intent, the prophet calls them out, making public their plans behind it all. Psalm 10:3 says, "For the wicked boast of his heart's desire, and the greedy man curses and spurns the Lord." See, we don't have any problem letting people know what we want. We think it's a good thing to dream. Dream big. Because if you dream small, you won't attain much. So let people know what you're dreaming. Maybe they'll look at you and they'll think, oh, I want to be like him. The wicked lets people know what's going on. Well, these people were planning something in private, and the prophet said, it's time to make it public. Let me tell you that wickedness doesn't just happen. You realize that. There's a conscious choice. Even so far as a plan and a purpose to every action, there is a conscious choice in evil, in wickedness. Someone decided this was what they would do. And you can look at every mass shooting, every assassination, and you will find plans. That's what the FBI looks at when they're investigating these types of things, because it's standard practice. Even in the murder of Charlie Kirk, they're investigating what this young man was thinking, what he was surrounded with, how he sat down and devised a plan to take this man's life. It isn't just imaginary dreaming. There is an intent to carry it out, and they do. Why? Listen to the last few verses, or last few words of this verse. It says, even a man in his heritage, because it is in the power of their hand. In the verse 1, it is in the power of their hand. In other words, because they can. We don't have a whole lot of power being poor country people. I mean, what power do we have to take something from someone? Well, we don't loan money, so we can't put a lien against somebody's property. We don't have money, so we can't push them out of their property by kind of forcing their hand, manipulating them, telling them we'll buy it. We have no authority, so we can't drive the price down, but others do. Doesn't mean that we can't be corrupt in our intents. Not only did the prophet declare their intent, but he also described their action. Verse 2, we read that again. Let's read it again. And they covet fields and take them by violence, and houses, and take them away, and they oppress a man in his house, even a man and his heritage. In other words, they use any means necessary, using violence, bullying, loopholes in the law, seizing lands and houses which were never to belong to them. Now, the Message says in verse 3, when we look at verse 3 in a minute, they see people only for what they can get out of them. And I think that's helpful for us to understand, because that's the thought process with people like this. People who are wicked and corrupt and they're rulers, they don't see people as people. They see them as something to get something from. Have you ever known someone like that? Attorneys who would rather be rich than do the right thing. Insurance agents selling for the sake of the commission rather than the need. Elected officials kowtowing to the wishes of the party rather than the needs of their communities, all to advance their agenda or make themselves a name. Pastors who preach a watered-down version of the Bible in order to get people in, knowing that what they're giving them does not help them. But it sure helps them get some more money coming in, be able to drive around their big cars. All so that they can keep their jobs, make their millions, rise to the top. From athletes to accountants, from real estate moguls to restaurateurs, it seems like everyone wants to own their own piece of the pie and is willing to drive over anyone to get it. Now, the egregiousness of these leaders' actions in Micah's prophecy could only be understood by knowing the laws that God set forth regarding the land. It was to remain with the families to whom it was given. In fact, in the law, it speaks about how they divided the land by string and by lot, or by line and by lot. In other words, they drew lines and then they drew lots. And the reason now, and you say, well, what's a lot? It's sort of like drawing straws, but it's leaving it, instead of up to chance, it's leaving it to the direction of God, because God would determine whose land it would be. Listen, the Bible says in the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, he speaks of the land of Israel being not theirs, but his. And because it's his land, he will divide it. And he has complete and total rule over it. And so for these people to take people's land, it was not theirs to take. It was not their choice to make. In fact, it was every 50th year, and I was wrong, not every 7th year, but every 50th year of Jubilee, that all of the land would return to the original families to whom it was given. So that the families would always have land. It didn't mean that someone who borrowed money on the land couldn't lose that land. They couldn't foreclose that land. But it meant that that land would ultimately go back to their families. That's what it was supposed to be. But you know what? The religious leaders didn't listen to God's rule in the first place. Why would they listen to the 50th year of Jubilee rule? It was to remain with the families, passed down from generation to generation. And this is the reason why the land of Israel is so important today to Israel. It's because they know what God gave them. It belongs to them. It belongs to God, but it's been given to them to be sojourners in. It's been taken from them now and given to other nations. But God said he's going to bring them back to it. And they're looking forward to it. Now, the land was all they had, and their ownership and control over that property gave them hope for the future. Not like us, land is a commodity to Americans. We buy it and we sell it. It's an investment from which one day we hope to be paid, hopefully handsomely. All right, let's move on. The third factor in their judgment is seen in the prophet delivering God's response. Look how he delivers God's response in verses 3 and 4. Therefore, thus saith the Lord, behold, and by the way, you will know something about a prophet. People had asked about prophets in the past. The prophets, people had asked about, some of y'all asked about what a prophet is in the church today. A prophet, prophetesses, those kind of things. A prophet was one who told what God had said. It was this idea of thus saith the Lord. That's why it was so important, for if they said this is what's going to happen and it doesn't happen, then they're not speaking for Yahweh God. Therefore, they are a false prophet. They're speaking on their own behalf. Don't listen to them. He says, thus saith the Lord, behold, against this family do I devise an evil, from which ye shall not remove your necks, neither shall you go haughtily, for this time is evil. In that day shall one take up the parable against you and lament with doleful lamentations and say, we be utterly spoiled. He hath changed the portion of my people. How he hath removed it from me, turning away, he hath divided our fields. In other words, everything they were working for, God was about to undo. Everything they spent their lives attaining, God was about to ruin. God condemns the actions of these rich and powerful. But it was interesting that God was referring specifically to a group of oppressors who were using any legal or non-legal means for a land grab that benefited only the receivers. Let it be it land or monies, inheritances or material possessions, taking something for the sake of ownership regardless of the cost to those from whom it is taken is dishonest gain, and it is a form of oppression. For this reason, the people are challenged to distance themselves from the same conduct. God's word to the leaders was given also to the people for a reason. Listen to what Proverbs 28:16 says. A leader who lacks understanding is very oppressive, but one who hates injustice unjust gain prolongs his life. In other words, he was saying, I'm laying down a principle for you. And that when you attach yourself to people who are powerful and rich and wealthy and leaders, they're going to oppress you. They're going to oppress you, especially when they're corrupt, particularly when those people are corrupt. Distance yourself from them, because you're going to find yourself being oppressed by them. There's another reason to refrain from this type of behavior. Those who fixate on what they want place what they have at risk. When you take your eyes off of things around you and fixate upon something you don't have, someone can come in and take what you do have. According to Aesop's fables, the dog was carrying a bone as he crossed the bridge, and he looked into the water and he saw his own reflection. He looked at this to be another dog and another bone. He desperately wanted the other bone, so he dropped the one that he had to scare the other dog. Of course, there was no other bone, no other dog, and he lost the one that he had into the water. Such is the nature of human greed, it says. In the effort to get what we want, we frequently lose what we have. You see, what these people didn't, they kept gaining and gaining and gaining. Oh, I guarantee it, they lost what they had. By the way, when you think about in history what happened to the poor, of Israel and Judah, when Nebuchadnezzar, when Serenike, whatever his name is, anyway, the guy from Assyria, from Nineveh, when they came and took and captured the land, who did they take captive? The leaders. Who did they kill? The warriors and the rich. Who did they leave in the land? The poor. So is the prophecy only a warning for those who lived at this time? I don't think so. J. Vernon McGee talked about in his commentary on Micah about going around the world visiting many places, and we've experienced a little bit of this, discovering the world's hatred for Americans. Do you know we're the only ones that think people in the world love us? I mean, not everyone, of course, but in general, he said that we have been haughty and proud, thinking the almighty dollar will balance the imbalance of poverty, that the American military will deter all the bad actors, neither of which has happened. Why? According to McGee, we are under the judgment of God because it has fallen into the hands of what he calls the godless rich. America has become its worst enemy. 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5 said, know this also, that in the last days perilous times shall come. For men shall be lovers of their own selves, covetous, boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, kids, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers, false accusers, incontinent, fierce, despisers of those that are good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasures more than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying the power thereof. Has he not described our day today to a T? Folks, we're already there in America. God is judging this nation that has gone from oppression to oppressors, from poverty to wealth, from being judged to judging others. So how do we counter it as believers, as the church? Well, let me be clear about this last factor. This last factor is always directed to God's children. Always directed to God's children. And as a responsible parent demands that a child stay away from bad kids, the prophet demands the congregation's abstention. In other words, don't get involved with the wicked. I think Jesus was fairly clear about that. The New Testament was fairly clear about that. Going into business with those, don't be unequally yoked with unbelievers. That's just with unbelievers. We think there's some pretty good unbelievers out there. There's some pretty good people out there. They're friends of mine. They're good. That's right. Listen, they are in a position. They are in a situation where they are easily tempted to become most corrupt if they become very rich. Do you want to be in business with them? How many times have you heard of business owners falling into corruption, tax evasion, those types of things, and being drugged down? And everyone involved, they all face the same consequences. Not necessarily jail, but they suffer. They lose jobs. They go under suspicion. They lose their names, their good names. We need to not be involved with them. Look at verse 5. Therefore thou shalt have none that shall cast a cord by lot in the congregation of the Lord. And what he's saying, he's still talking to the wicked, right? But he's saying it in front of those who are not wicked. He said, you're not going to have anybody. You're going to be left out on your own. There's nothing. You're not going to have anything when it comes to the congregation of God. He's telling the congregation, inferring to the congregation, stay away from them. Don't take part in their judgment. If you get involved, you will be judged the same. Now, we have the opportunity to claim a little wealth for ourselves through investments in companies which have made a mark on this world. Listen, invest wisely. Some of you work. You have 401ks. You have had 401ks. Maybe you still have money coming in from 401ks or from annuities, things that you have invested in, things that you have. Listen, separate yourself from those businesses which you know stand opposed to God's direct rule. Don't do business with the corrupt and unethical company who spends our dollars ingratiating themselves while people suffer. Stand up to the corrupt government officials who rise to the top on the backs of working families. Avoid those who support their causes, champion their efforts, or celebrate their accomplishments. And listen, if you have a friend who openly humiliates a beggar on the street, rebuke them, and if they don't change, avoid them. I don't apologize for what I say because 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 11 says, but now I have written unto you not to keep company if any man that is called a brother be a fornicator, a covetous, or an idolater, or a railer, or a drunkard, or an extortioner. With such an one do not even eat. We're to be an example. We're to be a testimony to others who are lost. But we're not to keep company with them. But particularly be on guard against that which tempts a man to sin easier than anything else. And that's greed. Luke chapter 12 verse 15 says, Jesus told him, watch out and be on guard against all greed because one's life is not in the abundance of his possessions. I think a good way to paraphrase kind of a little bit what Micah was saying is what we studied out of the book of Ecclesiastes. When you really think about it, the richest man in the world at that time wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, and he said, What good does it do to attain everything only when you die to have it given to someone else? You know what? Hearses don't have U-Hauls on the back of them. Always heard that. You can't take it with you. Unfortunately, many Americans are not so willing to follow this advice. When asked what you were willing to do for $10 million, this is in 1991, by the way. So $10 million was a lot of money back then. So let's make it $100 million. 2/3 of Americans polled would agree to at least one, some to several of the following. Would you abandon your entire family? 25% said yeah. Would you abandon your church? 25% said yeah. Would you become a prostitute for a week or more? 23% said yeah. Would you give up your American citizenship and then be deported really quick? 16% said yeah. I can't believe that 7% more would be willing to be a prostitute than to give up their citizenship. Would you be willing to leave your spouse? 16% said yeah. And we wonder why divorce rate's so high. Would you withhold testimony and let a murderer go free? 10%. Yeah. How about kill a stranger? Think that's crazy? 7% said, yeah, I'd do it. How many of you would how many of them would put their children up for adoption? Give up their own children for money? 3% said yeah. So what will you do with God's demands? That's the question. Because ultimately that's really comes down to. William Barclay wrote, "It was said of a self-centered young lady, Edith lived in a little world bounded on the north, south, east, and west by Edith." I hope no one can say that about you. If they can, you're prone to fall into greed and covetousness. And that's a really, really deep hole from which you may never find your way out. Any questions?